Before we start, I'd like to note that there are a few parts where Adam's audio pops a bit. I tried to tamp it down as best I could by selectively editing it, but editing it out made it sound more obvious, and then I hit it with a compressive filter, and some of it still got through, but if you hear a few sound pops, that's why. My bad.
Hello, Mage fans, and welcome to Mage the podcast that works hard towards ascension so you don't have to. I'm your host, Adam Simpson. I'm joined by my co-host, Terry Robinson, and today on Tomes of Magic, we're going to take a look at the Progenitors. But before we do that, Terry, do we have any announcements this week?
We do. I would just like to say, if you're listening to this before December 21st, applications are still open for the Jackalope Live Action LARP event, Mage Noir, set to happen in Austin, Texas, the weekend of April 2nd, 2022. It's a LARP game set in the 1950s, and I will be there as a sage bartender, possibly. Links and information on how to sign up for that are in the show notes. There are a few spots still open. Registration ends December 21st. If you go, see you there.
Okay, well, today we are looking at Convention Book Progenitors Revised. This was on the tail end of Revised Edition. We go today to the year 2013, and this is one of those 4 convention books that exists in their own unique neighborhood, which is 13 years after the Avatar storm started in the world of Mage, and they state that instead of ticking down towards a grand conclusion, it is instead a permanent thing that everyone is getting used to. So as we take a look at this book, we note that these convention and tradition books for Revised Edition usually were very good about sticking to a 100-page count. This one is 93 pages, and I think it's good to be a little bit more flexible with that. It has 5 authors, and this is the first Mage book of the year 2013. So, Terry, how about you start us off with a walkthrough?
I'd be glad to. It opens with a prelude, which is about an action scientist. This is a bullet-strewn shoot-'em-up involving the Progenitors taking out deviance with a capital D. It's a little self-aware. They talk right out of the gate about how Charles Reed, the creepy guy from the first Progenitor book, is dead, and this book, it kind of is like, no, we're going to counter this image, and we get this awesome back and forth between some shamanic character and this upright, good guy Progenitor, where it says, "These are healing waters recovered from your node your people took from us. The woman spits from under my foot. Destined for our clinic downtown. We're only trying to help people. Can't you psychopaths see that? I stepped down on the woman's throat." Like, let's just start with the premise that this man is actively stepping on a woman's throat while delivering this dialogue. "And when you're not here to administer the treatment, sweetie, what then? When they slather the salves, burn the incense, and drink the irradiated water, is it going to mend them or just make them more sick? The superstitious bullshit you people peddle is not medicine." She locks fierce eyes with me. "I have a right to believe in my own ways." Again, her throat is still actively being stepped on. "Right up until your right to believe compromises the health of the people around you, sweetie. That's where I step in." Literally, because he's stepping on her throat. With that, I cut off her windpipe. A few moments later, she's unconscious, and I don't stop choking the vile deviant. I just stare at her slack face and think about all the children she's treated. Yep, these are the good guys. So that's the prelude. Any thoughts, Adam?
I just want to say to our listeners at home, even if you have a really good point, don't step on people's throats. But in all seriousness, when I was reading Prelude's story, I thought it had a really good example of a hanging effect for a progenitor. That is, progenitors can use their life magic to hulk out and become super strong and super fast, which can actually be really cool in an action-oriented Mage game. And so they give an example of how this was a hanging effect. He went through the trouble of casting it with all the proper equipment before he got to the scene, and when he got there, he hits something behind his ear, activates the effect. I think it's very clever, and it works very well. So it's fun to see that.
Maybe he actually has a deviant heart, and the next 7 pages are actually him rattling off the downsides of that, but we'll get to that later.
Okay.
The next section is titled Introduction, Troubling Diagnosis. The opening line is, "The technocracy is sick," and not like sick in the 90s sense. We're now firmly in the 2010s, where that is no longer a good thing. The Progenitors feel that they could be the hero, and the consensus is talking about life and better living in a way it hasn't before. The public is clamoring for options, and many of the options they are grabbing for are mystical instead of scientific, and people are using that for bad things. The theme is new heroes and old lines. There has been a rise of the action scientist, which is out of the lab. This is kind of a microcosm of the union's difficulty in keeping people in line, where you have people who want to leave the lab and other people are like, no, we should stay in the lab. The mood is treating the future. They have a chance to shine with no member having the ability to go completely idle. They are looking to prevent a return kind of to the Dark Ages. Going forward, there's a section that says, yep, Avatar Storm, here to stay. We're setting up a technocratic civil war, just in case you hadn't noticed. The dimensional anomaly severed the head of the Union. This group is no exception. So just in case you thought any of the weird stuff that was brought up in NWO was one of those like one-off things, like whenever Richard Dansky wrote for a book and was like, by the way, this is how cosmology works for a game that's not mine. This is patently avoiding that by saying, yup, everything that came out like 2 months ago is still the case. And with that, that ends the introduction. Chapter 1 is entitled Patient History. We find out that the whole of the Progenitor Administration, that's administration with a capital A, the group that ran the convention, was off-world when the anomaly struck. Much of the rest of the convention was in research labs, and now they have become active. There is a war inside the technocracy that is brewing, and one facet of that war is that the NWO is looking to bring universal healthcare, and the Syndicate is looking for that not to happen because it is profit-driven. This completely fails to understand that there are many nations at current in the world that have fully private, profitable, universal healthcare systems. There was a undersea facility by the name of Yamaja, or Yamaja, or I don't know what language that is, Yemaja, which suggests that they are getting around the restrictions of the consensus by building deep sea facilities. And now instead of going off-world, you go under the water. Cue reference to Blood Dim Tides. And it's a cool way to get your thin reality. It also mentions that there's a lot of messes to be cleaned up. There were intrusion drones and the like that were set out into the world to do very specific things, and now that they are no longer getting orders, they have gone rogue. It also makes a passing reference to be like, yep, Nefandi, how about that? And then it kind of launches into a history section. It says that the New World Order says we have won, but we know that we are sick. The anomaly caused the replacement of administration with the Shared Government Council, and now decisions are being pushed back to local groups, more to prevent another cataclysm like the Dimensional Anomaly from decapitating the entire group. This results in almost everyone constantly being watched by other people, not necessarily in an NWO way, but since there's no single leader, people are constantly jockeying for position and to promote their projects and such. The gap between extraordinary citizens and membership has closed quite a bit, with them tending to work side by side. Again, another trend that we saw throughout Revised that was very much accelerated in these convention books. Part of the house cleaning that came with the establishment, though, of this new Shared Government Council is that there were a lot of unethical experiments that happened. There were likely Nefandi progenitors that were doing bad stuff, and this is kind of presented as a story option. And then it goes directly into history. And it starts with a note that's like, hey, we read the NWO convention book, and that seemed like a good idea. It says that there was a person from the NWO who said it's useful to have a shared history, and maybe we should do that too, which is an amazing cover for being like, oh shit, we need to fill 8 pages with history. How do we justify having this in in-world? Well done, because, I mean, all books have a history section, so you may as well justify it in world. So that's kind of cool. What is now the Progenitors was formerly the Kosians, or the Hippocratic Circle, and they joined the Order of Reason in 1325 and have been there since the beginning. And we also get a peek at what the initial houses were, like the House of Fire, which dealt with infection, the House of Knives for surgery, the House of Mandrake, which studied herbalism, and the Warrior Phylaxoi, I think, that their original guiding goal, that they were somewhat religious, so they tended to say that they wouldn't do anything that mimicked a divine creator. Not all members were like that. They mention early laboratories like the Kraken House, which eventually helped come up with a plague cure, and they acted as the field surgeons of the order. Several centuries pass, as happens in all good histories of Mage, and in the 1700s, racism and sexism started creeping in, and by the 1800s, their work started deviating from their strong moral core. At the time, Basil Rathbone's skeleton keys were helping to bring down extreme elements even within the Order of Reason, and we get information on the Promethean atrocities, which were a set of beings made alive from death that were done as like kind of an unholy alliance between the progenitors and the Society of Ether. The First World War becomes a field day for harvesting corpses, and it also made a mention about the same person needing to be killed multiple times. I'm like, this I would like a little more explanation as to why that was necessary, but still, that's kind of metal. The advent of the Dust Bowl in the 30s and the collapse of the agricultural expanses of the American West brought their agricultural expertise from within the progenitors to the front, because when I think progenitor, I think corn. In modern times, they helped stamp out the Nefandi during World War II, as well as a lot of other Nefandi that weren't formally on the list of Nefandi that needed to be killed. So I thought that was kind of fun. They took a passive role during the fight for disability rights, and they had a number of rebels and internal members that are like, that's not a good thing. In the 1940s, they produced the first clone black suits that were made by Mohammed ibn Yusuf al-Musha'awidi. So we have a name for the person who invented the black suit clone. The 1950s saw the rise of the gene as mutagenic engineers became the gene engineers. In the 80s saw the rise of the pharmacopoeist who partnered with the Syndicate and started making bank off of drugs. In the 90s, the Hitmark program was started, but it was said that it was internally opposed by some people, and those people who opposed it were removed. This is interesting because in canon, we get a Hitmark program that goes back centuries, if not millennia. So I'm assuming they're referring to the Hitmark 5. Then they talk about being hit by a dimensional anomaly where literally technocratic facilities fell out of space. Again, now it's been officially stated in 2 books. They literally fell out of space and landed on the Earth. And I really want to see a game where those materializing spaceships are now something that people are fighting over, like collecting, and there's a mad scramble for that. But maybe we get that in Void Engineers. They also talk about the family toll, that there are now many orphan kids whose parents were off-world, and kind of vice versa. They have a new closeness with the Void Engineers, who have provided them new research facilities and a sudden push to help in the field, as well as a desire to move forward. This history section kind of moves at a breakneck speed. I think that was 1/7 the length of the NWO one in terms of raw words. The next section they discuss are relations, and they kind of half do a comparison of each other convention being like a different body part, but they really only do that with like 2. They say that the iterators are half of the great technocratic experiment of biotechnology, that the iterators are trying to build a new computer, which is not something I remember seeing in the Iteration X convention book, which we reviewed. So that kind of came out of nowhere. That's something the NWO also kind of mentioned, that they had gone after autochthonia for quite some time. They mentioned that the NWO are the brains of the technocracy, but those brains are old and have dementia, and that they are pursuing Project Pulse, which is an attempt to calm them down. It's not known by many. Also, they're working to find a way to create secret mind control clones. So that's kind of cool. They have a tense relationship with the Syndicate, as they are demanding questionable clones and illegal drugs, and some decry this relationship. As I mentioned, the Void Engineers have created deep sea bases for them. They frequently request weird shit, and the progenitors are like, seem like good people. We should probably provide it to them. Okay. They also mention that progenitors and Void Engineers disproportionately turn into marauders. So then they do a review of the traditions. They hate the choristers enough that religious technocrats are looked on with suspicion. The ecstatics they tend to have a problem with because they tend to try out new untested drugs on mortals. And then they mention, we have a kinship with the Euthanatos. Sometimes you need to remove an arm to save a body. And they also mentioned a fascinating phenomenon where occasionally a progenitor will be asked for an interview with a Euthanatoi, and it is kind of implied that it is a determination as to whether they are going to be marked for assassination, which, I don't know about you, is the coolest scene to have to roleplay through. I know of it confirmed nowhere else within the Mage canon, but I've never let that stop me from having a good story. They hate the Order of Hermes' elitism and unwillingness to work at large scale. They blame the Etherites for homeopathy, and they call the virtual adepts angry and organized. I agree with one of those adjectives. And that they're currently engaged in a race to create nanotech viruses. And I'm like, I don't know what that is, but sounds cool. They talk about how they're Nefandi in their midst, that they have seemingly suffered no losses after the dimensional anomaly, despite the fact that literally every other book is like, speaking of people who've taken it directly to the face, the Nefandi, how about that? Turns out when you worship a squid from beyond the stars and you can't talk to them anymore, your power base is diminished. They mention Schirn's disease, which I think is a reference to an old thing from White Wolf magazine as having something that could theoretically be tied to vampirism. They've recently been approached by the Glasswalkers about some sort of project, and we get a mention of both mummies and hunters, so take a drink, everyone.
I thought it was very interesting how they posited this new idea that the Void Engineers and the Progenitors have grown close after the dimensional anomaly. They helped each other, they found common cause, they found that they worked together well, and they really made a relationship out of that. And for me, that's interesting because when the Void Engineers were first introduced at the very beginning of the first edition of Mage, there was one of the kind of ideas that a storyteller was offered was, hey, the Void Engineers, they're the odd man out among the other conventions. Are they going to leave? Are they going to break away? Don't know. And then the let's see, I think it was second edition for Mage when the first Void Engineer book came out. There was this suggestion of, oh, maybe they're going to join with the Nefandi, leave the Technocratic Union. So that idea was still being worked with. And so here, Void Engineers are finding a real rewarding partnership with the Progenitors, and that's going to give them closer ties to the Technocratic Union. And so now it's like, okay, no, they're not going to leave. They found their place. They found their friends. So that was interesting for me as a longtime Mage fan. I really like this idea of there are a number of different bottom of the ocean facilities. They mentioned, I guess it's pronounced Yamaja as like the biggest one, the most noticed perhaps, but there are other ones also. And so I thought, that is cool. I like that because that is a way where you can keep it on Earth, but you can get far away from civilization, and so the paradox risk is going to be noticeably different, and so you can still have these cool adventures where you're at the bottom of the sea or in caves underground at the bottom of the sea. You can have some interesting adventures play out there. I like having that possibility. More mention of the fear of the Nefandi throughout Revised Edition. The Nefandi were kind of in the background. It even mentioned a few times about how they're weaker now and they're not going to be as much trouble as they were in the past. And so here, just like in the New World Order revised book, they're saying, no, Nefandi, they're bad, they cause trouble, we're afraid of them, they are a very real threat, and we are worried about this. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I always thought they were interesting villains to work into games. Okay, one thing that I thought was kind of funny, maybe I'm being too picky about this, but one of the themes running through this book is they wanted to react against the over-the-top villainousness of the first convention book for Progenitors, saying, no, we're decent, clean people, we're cleaning up our act, we're trying to be the good doctors that we were always supposed to be. And yet they have started Project Pulse. They are using untraceable drugs to influence the leadership of the New World Order. It's like, okay, on one level, I can see how, okay, that's kind of self-defense. The New World Order, they really are trying to control everybody, and that is something to think about. But then on the other hand, look, guys, if your Project Pulse is really, really successful, how long are you going to remain clean, decent guys? And it's just a question I'm putting out there for Mage fans to think about. And finally, when we get to the end of the chapter, there's this, the relations. I thought when they talked about the other conventions, I thought that section was very strong. Now, when they talked about their thoughts on the 9 Mystic Traditions, I found that section to be rather weak. I was so enjoying that last book we looked at, New World Order Revised, where they had this really clever gimmick of this is how we handle each of the traditions when we have to deal with them in the field. And it just really, really cool. Here, it just wasn't the same. It's just, here are these traditions. We don't like them. We kind of like them, and we really hate them. And it's like, yeah, okay, could have been so much better. And finally, there's a mention towards the end of how, look, vampires are real. We have observed them. We can't hide this fact anymore. We probably ought to think about that. I'll bet less vampires in the world would be a good idea. And I was reading that thing. I was saying this months ago when we were recording episodes. If the technocracy knew that the vampires were real, then they would see them as a threat, at least on par with the 9 Mystic Traditions. Like, look, these things are evil. These things are numerous. Root them out. So I could totally see that point of view. But that wraps up my thoughts on Chapter 1.
On the vampire thing, I like how some formally recognize the difference between the Camarilla and the Sabbat, where others are like, there are some vampires that are real noisy, and there are some vampires that are real quiet. And they just kind of shrug their shoulders at it. So I like the difference in understanding, like, we kill the noisy ones. Okay. Chapter 2 is entitled Residency, and it starts out with the ranks. You can start out as a student, whereby you compete fiercely with others and do lab work plus course work. And you can do additional work to look better, but it doesn't actually count. And this section totally wasn't bitter about academic science. You can graduate to research assistant, where you'll likely awaken or not. There are a few extraordinary citizens that act as primary researchers, which is a level above, and they are reported to by students and research assistants, but most of them at this point are awakened. They tend to be very curious. They are very driven. This is the highest level you can go without hitting management. Generally, there's at least one primary researcher per facility, but there may be more. And the goal of a PI is to answer a specific question. Labs are administered by research director who manage PIs and are generally considered strategic. They do not generally get involved in particular lines of studies, but oversee the general direction of research at a larger scale. Counselors are research directors that also help steer the convention. They still have their regular responsibilities, and the Shared Ethics Council, which kind of governs them, is still split. The Progenitors, as a side note, are no longer clearing members for processing because they mention it has a risk for pregnant women, probably also known to cause cancer in the state of California. They have a support staff, which are not members, and they talk about the enlightened and non-enlightened members that are kind of a washout from the program that are unable to rise to the challenge. They may do things like recruiting, cleaning glassware, but otherwise they kind of keep them around as they just kind of know too much. Much like the NWO book, they indicate that there are crucial traits, and each methodology cares about these in different degrees. They talk about devotion, openness, mastery, and the fourth principle of compassion, and that facade engineers place mastery at the apex where gen engineers value openness. And I thought this was an interesting framework of indicating that the methodologies are kind of differences in mixes of personality types. There is also a divide between the illicit drug folks who are annoyed at the lab folks who tend to forget who pays the bills. They also kind of talk about how people leave the organization. And they talk about students often freak out once they find out what's actually going on. They're like, yeah, this kind of happens. It also makes sense when you expose mortals to things that can bend the human mind as they stare at horrors from beyond space and time. But usually they calm down and come to their senses and join us. And I'm like, okay. They also indicate that there are some kind of old-timers who want their direct reports to agree with them on everything, and bad things can happen if you don't agree. Again, I think this is a mention to the cloned replacement kid in the 1E book. And they talk about the methodologies, and they have a new bunch of sets of them. And when I think methodologies, I think groups. Adam, who the dink is in the Progenitors?
Well, there are a few surgeons that work alone. So let's take a look at the groups here. Applied sciences and the micro-methodologies are new in this book. Micro-methodologies are actually full methodologies, but many people have taken to calling them micro because they have smaller budgets and fewer members. Among the micro-methodologies are the Chalihotrian Society that pursues veterinary sciences. Rather than pets, they focus on animals that provide food or labor to large numbers of people. The agronomists focus on plants that are crops to large populations. The preservationists are environmental scientists looking for ways to influence the masses to clean up the environment. The psychopharmacopeists, that's a short one, specialize in psychiatry and psychology. They split off from the pharmacopeists in 1960. They learn mind techniques from the New World Order, but don't agree with their ethics. I can't imagine why. Facade engineers focus on creating clones. Clones for fieldwork, infiltration, and clone bodies to extend the lives of technocrats. Although records on their history is spotty, rumors circulate that centuries ago, secluded wizards experimented on animals, creating strange monsters. Many of these experiments were actually research into immortality that were shared with other wizards. The Order of Reason managed to gather many of these specialists in the Renaissance to form the Chirurgians? Sorry, Latin's not my first language. This new group was granted security and privacy in exchange for supplying immortality to the Order of Reason's leaders. This relationship was successful and continues down to today. In 2003, the Progenitors' new leadership convinced them to share more information with their colleagues, but they remain the smallest of the large methodologies and the best funded. Their clones are indispensable to the New World Order. Gen engineers create and modify life forms at the genetic level. Instead of cloning a dog to spy on someone, they can supply a new pet that looks nothing like the animals we know. Instead of cloning your friend, they can give your friend super strength and the ability to cling to walls. They trace their history back to the hematologists who studied blood in the Order of Reason in the 1300s. The official beginning of the modern gen engineers was in 1954, after realizing the implications of the discovery of DNA. They are active today, searching the world for new DNA sequences they can use. The gen engineers are turning away from bioenhancements for agents, even though the prologue fiction made it look cool, and turning to medical support for the masses. Pharmacopeists is a divided methodology. Some work on drugs that provide tremendous medical benefits for the masses, while others produce addictive and dangerous drugs that the masses can't get enough of and pay for. They look to the Kosian apothecaries trained by Hippocrates as their beginning. For hundreds of years, they guarded their secrets carefully, but the order of reason brought them into the light in the Renaissance. From then, they flourished as their secrets became public science. Today, the legitimate side of the methodology operates much like a pharmaceutical company, while the illegitimate side operates like a drug cartel. They produce a lot of neat funds for the technocracy, and prestige is a natural result. Applied sciences is listed among the methodologies, but it isn't actually a methodology. I would call it a grassroots movement inside the progenitors. This movement is made up of mostly young people that want to get out of the lab and become active in the field. Applied sciences members are mostly recognized members of methodologies, which is how they fit into the convention hierarchy. Applied sciences has groups within it that sound a lot like methodologies but aren't. These groups are recognized by progenitor leadership and get funding, so perhaps we should think of them as departments. The first of these is the Deviancy Scene Investigators. Although they sound like people who get to really cool parties after they've ended, they actually investigate threats to the consensus. When reality deviants cause problems, DSI members show up with law enforcement credentials. They have become useful to many different groups in the technocracy. Medicine's Sans Superstition is mostly pharmacopoeists who travel the world to practice medicine for the needy at hot spots such as war zones, inner cities, and disaster scenes. They also protect their patients from supernatural dangers and spread acceptance of the technocratic paradigm. The Biosphere Explorers visit all manner of unpopulated places to study life forms for new genetic, chemical, and other resources. Gen engineers and pharmacopoeists are often found here. Damage Control is the oldest of these groups active in the field. They protect the convention by defending their facilities and performing missions in the field to remove outside threats. Ethical Compliance is a group inside Damage Control that polices the convention for infractions. For most progenitors, one visit from Ethical Compliance is enough to make them fall in line. Ethical Compliance also has the authority to conscript other progenitors when a problem needs solving. So, my thoughts. When we reviewed the first progenitor book, I noted a convention that punished new recruits for annoying an instructor, and I said this group is probably not going to last. Well, page 40 of this book backs me up, making the same observation. It's interesting to note that this book states progenitor leadership pressures all members to be part of a methodology. I think the micro-methodologies are, to be honest, a little dull. I would either fold their duties into the main methodologies or just say many progenitors aren't in a methodology. We're told that gen engineers are turning away from biologically enhancing agents and getting into medical help for sleepers. While this does make them look like nice guys and probably conforms more to revised editions frowning on things we don't see in everyday life, I don't support anything that makes a perfectly good methodology boring. Applied Sciences has a nebulous place in the convention. It seems to be a grassroots movement that started dictating policy to the convention's leadership. Last time I checked, the technocracy doesn't take kindly to new recruits rewriting the rules. I would recast it as a mandate from leadership for each methodology to make sure it is active in the field and supplying members to work in understaffed departments like damage control, etc.
And that kind of brings us around to the end of the chapter. I thought the methodologies were interesting because it continues a trend that we got from at least the NWO, that there is at least one methodology within the convention which is disproportionately important to the rest of the technocracy. So the facade engineers are indicated as being particularly important. The ivory tower is likewise was indicated as being kind of like the brains of the operation. I kind of liked I think the micro methodologies were what we would probably just call cabals if they were tradition groups or something like that. And,
I can see that.
And they indicate that Norman Borlaug was a mage. So this is the first time we've got a mortal that was added to that. I think one of my favorite mentions is the facade engineers never abused their power, as abusing that power would involve working with the outside world. And I just kind of like that. The idea that the progenitors were kind of devoted lab folk is something I never got a sense for in the previous books, at least not the degree to which it was presented here, so it's kind of a running joke. Sure, fine, cool. I was surprised when I found Medicine Sans Superstition. The French word for superstition is superstition, so it works. So I thought it was just an awkward mashup there. One of the interesting things is they talk about the Biosphere Explorers that is looking for natural compounds, and they mention that things found in nature are not subject to rejection, capital R, which is the term used in this book for paradox. And I thought that was kind of interesting. And again, we got an internal police group called Ethical Compliance. And so I think a lot of these groups are useful. They all kind of make sense. But again, it's weird where they're like, yes, the progenitors bringing you advances in the worlds of wheat and dogs. And you're like, okay, well, sure, why not? Revised tend to make things bigger, and that's the direction they went with here. Chapter 3 is entitled Prescriptions, and it starts with lackluster characters with no stats. Yeah, it starts with a bunch of progenitors that are like, yep, these are good people that are doing solid work. We can't give you any numbers around them, and all of them were born recently. And you're like, oh, okay. That's a thing. The next part we get are rumors and lore, and we get a few here that are kind of interesting. One is Team 215, which is a lost research team, echoing the idea from the previous book that certain groups have been continuing to send transmissions. It kind of gives an idea of how you could have a group that was lost during the dimensional anomaly, but hasn't disembodied yet. It suggests that there are certain areas of the world where maybe they keep going back and forth across the gauntlet because it is so thin, or because there's something metaphysically weird. It refers to the topology of Tibet's energy field being relatively unknown, making it a mountainous Bermuda Triangle. And the Bermuda Triangle never really gets any information made, so sure, just make up stuff. Just like, if you're ever wondering, am I going too far, always remember what happened to the magic systems in Isle of the Mighty, and fear not. There is... There's lots of space. Mage will forgive you. We also get Graft Chimera 467, which is a plant that will become more plant that may gain the ability to metabolize quintessence. Also, it combines human DNA from multiple plant families and plants, hybrids, statistical likelihood, thriving, destroy all plants. They were trying to make a menacing evil clone plant, and I just don't really feel like it stuck the landing. I thought it was a cool idea, but it's just like, there could be plants everywhere and they'll be all the same type. We are given no information on like that it can like move or anything like that. So it's like, oh no, weeds. We get the idea that there is the Promethean Society. This kind of bothered me because up to this point in the book, there were a few editing errors, but here there was a flat out internal inconsistency where in one part it talks about the grand housekeeping happening in the 1860s. And then later it's like, it happened specifically in 1897. And you're like, okay. And it suggests that there are a group of kind of like Frankenstein-esque resurrection obsessed progenitors in England that are up to their old tricks. And it does the thing where it's like, they think they're gone. They've hidden themselves perfectly, but they recently ran into a man with the same initials as a guy from before. And you're like, come on, villains, you really need to work on your coming up with other names. Also, they talk about a British person by the name of E. Stewart. I just assume 12% of people in Great Britain are named E. Stewart, so I don't really think that's much of a lead. That's like saying his name was John Smith. How many could there be? Like a couple. They also talk about the Lockwood Hive, which is a guy who went kind of kooky and created a whole bunch of mentally connected clones. And I like there's a part where there's like, yeah, he started popping up in a bunch of places, and we were really hoping it was correspondence magic. Turns out it wasn't. Oops. The next section we got is entitled Fronts. And they say this is how they operate, and this is where they recruit. They say that the model in academia is to come up with an invention, pass it to an extraordinary citizen, see if they can copy it, and then keep doing that until mortals can figure it out. And they're like, sometimes this takes a while. They act as front people to the media, taking advantage of their credentials to plant ideas in the public. And they give the example of the deep green thinking, which is trying to leapfrog technological levels for underdeveloped parts of the world by just giving cutting-edge scientists to people in not cutting-edge areas. And they say their major opponent is human bureaucracy and demands for bribes. And this answers the question of, if Revised fundamentally says that the traditions are ineffective and nuisances, and you're playing a technocrat, who can your enemies be? And the answers generally are going to be the Nefandi and mortals. And this kind of gives fodder for that. They indicate that the mad scramble for biotech firms has also been fertile grounds. They make a company that I'm pretty sure is just a send-up of Monsanto, that they're also found in hospitals, forensics areas, and environmental remediation. I think they reverse the arrow of causality in environmental remediation. Like, they're called in to help build new structures. And like, remediation is usually when whatever was there before did an oopsie. And now there's a lot of fluorine everywhere. They mention a mobile clinic by the name of Health Bomb, which comes into the area and does an interesting thing in that it provides health services kills deviance and kind of shores up the local reality? And I think this is a really interesting question that hadn't come up before. It is reasonable to think that certain underserved communities are disproportionately likely towards are more subject to entities that may prey on lower socioeconomic status, which could cause problems for the consensus. And I like that. It kind of suggests that in a certain way, poverty is one of the enemies that the technocracy ultimately has to deal with. And I think that creates a very interesting human campaign that also allows you to seamlessly blend in elements of other supernaturals in with your game. And I thought that was kind of neat.
I agree. However, if a bus pulls up in my neighborhood and it says health bomb on the side, I'm not getting in there.
I assume if it was health bomb, it would be like something you throw in your water before exercising, like about to take a run, take a health bomb, or like it's like shaped like a hand grenade or something in a poorly thought out marketing campaign that ultimately gets a bunch of kids expelled. It gives us some advice on progenitor amalgams and how to deal with them. They talk about how the progenitor organization is largely flat, so there's not so much of a command structure, so you need to justify your choices and deliver results. And they kind of mention that everyone has a little bit of dirty laundry, which I think is an interesting idea, that it's kind of more of a damage control than what we got with the NWO, where your goal is to just hide all evidence of failure. That they tend to be curious and that they are prone towards corruption, whether it be from the Syndicate or the Nefandi. They are often insular, and then they give us the group Quality Assurance, which is a group that is purging rogue projects. That we find out that the Greylock incident introduced in the NWO book, where a hitmark engaged with the Masters of Forces and things went poorly, is because it had garbled programming as part of an attempt to, and this is the part that I didn't quite follow, that the hitmark in question had been given certain programming and thought that it was reporting to a member of the previous administration, and then something bad happened. And it very much feels like how the Euthanatoi were trying to purge the technocratic elements of the Seraphi from the traditions. So I like that idea of we still have messes, we need to purge them, but we also need to do it quietly. They talk about how the two options they have are remediation, which is to bring someone back in again, that they are very likely to let someone ignore kind of past crimes or mistakes if they're willing to work with them again. And we get an example of that, I think, at the end of the book. Or repudiation, where they just flat out murderate the guy. And I really think that group kind of distills the current plight of the progenitors. I really think this book does a great job explaining what a progenitor game would be in a way that I find interesting. I don't think Mage has the toolbox to do kind of the subtle political machinations that an NWO game might do. It may involve a lot of role-playing, and there aren't a lot of systems for it, but this kind of progenitor game, stealth ops with a few key moments of negotiation, I think is something that the game could handle pretty well in an interesting way. It goes through the roles that a progenitor may have in another group, and it's interesting because to me it uses like game terms where it refers to the role of the analyst, the face, the heavy, the infiltrator, the lead, and the medic, which I appreciate because it may not be an in-world thing, but at a gaming table, if I think it is at the point with a lot of groups, if you're saying, yeah, I'm the group's face, people will know what you mean. You're the social character that uses guile and charm in an attempt to get what is needed, and maybe you're not the heavy or what have you. It talks about how progenitor groups often have mixed goals and that their goals are often kind of internally competing. We also get the progenitor's Hippocratic Oath, which they suggest everyone may take a different one. And I love this kind of in-world stuff. And it lists a whole bunch of things they're going to do. And my favorite line is, I will respect the secrets confided in me even after death. Then we get gear. And this is interesting because it kind of eschews a lot of the problems that I normally associate with gear. For instance, when we were reading Technomancer's Toy Box, we had those brain pills where it's like, they have an enlightenment of 3, and if you roll them, you can increase your intelligence by 1 temporarily. This really eschews a lot of enlightenment rolls, and it just says, when you put a nano patch on, it just heals 1 point of lethal damage, or a point of ag if you blow a point of willpower. I liked that. I like much more reliable devices. Some of them were kind of ridiculous, like the non-puncturing injector, which is basically a syringe plus correspondence effects. And here it says dimensional science. I'm not sure why. This is something the book does in a couple of places where it kind of confuses dimensional science with correspondence. But and it requires a dexterity plus energy weapons roll, and another one requires dexterity plus quick draw, because why not? But I thought a bunch of the devices were pretty cool. And then it does something that that was an interesting idea, but I felt was poorly thought out. It says that most modifications, that there are a set of body modifications that can occur. So it gave you the equipment. Here's the more bioorganic stuff. And it falls into 4 things: adaptive prostheses, biomods, sensory alterations, and xenotransplantations. And then it doesn't treat sensory alterations as its own thing. It just kind of lumps that in with biomods. It also doesn't explain why something would be one versus another. Like in some cases it makes sense. Like if you're going to literally rip the heart out of a werewolf and shove it into someone, that's probably a xenotransplantation. But a lot of the other things, what is genetic, what is prosthesis necessarily? It suggests that the adaptive prostheses are synthetic and be hot swapped, but then in the descriptions of some, they're actually more organic. The prostheses are kind of suggested as being electromechanical in some cases, but that's not necessarily clear. You get a lot of Inspector Gadget stuff, which I thought was kind of neat and fun. It talks about how you can have like a limb that is specialized in something, although some of them kind of fall down on the job. For instance, bone spurs, it lists as they are 1 lethal weapons. I have no idea what a 1 lethal weapon is. I've literally read every mage book up until this point, and then it's like, it does other things, like, that bone spurs would do. It would be helpful if there were a little bit more information about that. The xenotransplantations are batshit, for lack of a better term, and who knows, maybe batshit is a type of xenotransplantation. You can get the ass of a bat transplanted onto you or something. These are very difficult to use. They require high stamina. They do permanent levels of health damage to you if it exceeds your stamina rating. Rejection can occur if something bad happens and suddenly your heart just like explodes out of your chest or something. We should have just entitled this thing Things for NPCs That Are Not Worth It for Players. A lot of them have enlightenment, but enlightenment is kind of never rolled, so I'm not sure why it is included. So it just, the systems really didn't hang together to me for this. So that was interesting. Adam, did you have a favorite device or body modification?
Now that you mention it, yeah, actually, I love the quad leg system. I thought that was awesome. This is basically where it's like a prosthetic where a person would remove their actual legs or their regular looking prosthetic legs and replace them with these sort of mechanical legs that, as long as you're wearing baggy pants, they look close enough to human legs. But once you, undo the zipper and free the legs, each leg splits into 2 like kind of mechanical spider legs. So basically you've got a guy with 4 legs who can climb walls or any other object without using his hands at all. So he can still use like handheld weapons while he's doing it. And I just think that's really cool, whether it's an NPC villain or I've even had a few players who would say, yeah, I want that. That's awesome. So yeah, I know it's creepy. I know it's weird, but I think it's cool.
And it's just one of those great things where like your characters encounter a guy with kind of baggy pants and then like stuff goes down and all of a sudden you've like, Mage has finally justified the existence of Jenko jeans, those pants with like 36-inch wide things. And I also feel like there are progenitors that do advertisements in the form of like as seen on TV products. Like, are you tired of not having enough legs?
I can just see an NPC. Yeah, you wait till I take my pants off. No need. No, really.
But Adam, you missed what was obviously the best item, the deviance heart, which allows you to take an extra action. But that action must be spent to harm someone. I hope that includes the ability to harm people emotionally. Like you get an extra action to just shout insults and be like, your parents never loved you. You slept your way through college. It adds a success to all strength-based actions. You regenerate 2 bashing or 1 lethal damage. The only downside is that every scene you have to roll your willpower against difficulty 8 or you fly into a homicidal rage. But you may be asking, Terry, I have a willpower of 10. What are the odds of me failing that roll? Well, I ran the numbers, kids, and based on what I found, about 22%. So you have a little bit more than a 1 in 5 chance of being cool or committing just homicide a lot. I never really get the sense that they've run through the numbers on this. I also like in troll hide where they're like, yeah, it's the height of a troll. Sure, they're strictly larger than a human, but it doesn't cover all of you. That would just be weird. I'm like, you're telling me there's not enough skin on this 7.5 foot tall man to cover this petite, like a lady that is also a part of, okay. I mean, like you figure they would be able to cut it down into 2, and maybe if you had a small set of twins, they would They would both get it. But anyway, this is the insightful journalism we bring to this. So those are cool, but almost never justified. I would give them to NPCs and then remove most of the downside from them, especially considering the fact that like an Enlightenment 5 device are things like, this is a space car that has a cannon attached to it that can kill angels. But here they're like, it lets you take an extra action, but your head might explode. I'm like, that doesn't seem like it's worth 5 Enlightenment, but that's just me. And then we get to the procedures, which is to say rotes. There's a bunch of interesting rotes that have absolutely no systems associated with it. Like, here's the thing that makes people super old. We're not going to tell you what that does. Also, here's something to make super cocaine, because we needed to make cocaine better. And then it introduces several enlightened drugs, all of which are significantly worse than just plain cocaine. It also indicates that they take 5 points of quintessence to make 1 dose. 5 points of quintessence, it's suggested, are worth millions, unless you use the conversion in Horizon Stronghold of Hope. Stronghold of Coke. Horizon Stronghold of Hope, in which case you could just trade that quintessence to someone else and buy a lot of cocaine. Remember, if you take nothing else from this podcast, cocaine is overpowered in the world of darkness. We get a bunch of other rotes. I'm going to say they gave it the old college try. For instance, biometric holographic recreation is a life 2, time 2 rote that basically lets you look back in time, and it's like you can copy everything down to the mode of dust. Okay, then why does it require life and not matter if you're reconstructing dust? There's no indication of how many successes are required for kind of any of these. Yeah, it's kind of annoying. Again, though, we get some amazing writing throughout. Stopgap Resurrection is a life 4, time 4 effect that allows you to briefly bring someone back to life for 1 minute per success. And it says, at the end of the duration, the target dies once more. Most scientists use this procedure to provide a liable, if temporary, eyewitness. And it kind of suggests that when you bring someone back to life, they don't spend all of those minutes yelling, I'm temporarily alive again. So again, systems I kind of wished were a thing. There's another rote where it's like, this is how you blow up a clone from a distance by killing a similar clone, which is just metal. I have no idea how that works, but sure, why not? We get a system on how to turn people in chronic care facilities into quintessence batteries. Thanks. Then we get into the gen-engineered creatures. And this created, the playing gen-engineered creatures gives you one of the greatest lines, because like people are like, Mage is part of the world of darkness, which makes it a game of personal horror. And the opening sentence is, can I play a gen-engineered creature? It's an obvious question. And then like you crack up at a look about werewolf and you're like, we cry as Gaia burns, or a vampire book. We've engaged in struggles against our elders for centuries. And we're like, can I play a sentient octopus? Of course you can, Timmy. Here's the rules. Don't be stupid. And people are like, why do you like Mage, Terry? I'm like, the question,
no reason.
Exactly. The question answers itself. I'm like, maybe because I want to be a hyper-intelligent whale. And we get 4 types of gen-engineered characters. We get the cephalomorph, which is a giant squid thing, where it makes the notion where it's like cephalomorphs don't have the ability to talk or communicate unless they're given that ability. And I'm like, oh, you mean the group who spits in the eye of God by jamming together different creatures together may not have figured out how to shove a mouth that can literally scream at you from under the water into a creature. What an oversight. Cetaceomorph is some sort of cetacean, so a whale or dolphin or something similar. We get a Dracomorph, which is a dragon, and a Sauromorph, which is a lizard person, which is somehow different than the Dracomorph, but sure, why not? I have to take evidence. So every podcast I've ever been on involves me yelling about dolphins being too smart. I get that they're intelligent given that they are non-human mammals and that they are clever and like, this dolphin can count to 3. But a Cetaceomorph in here, the base model has an intelligence of 5. That immediately puts it in like the top 2% of humans. This is a dolphin with PhD level understanding of things. Now, if you then take that and say, if you haven't put the pieces together that they're undersea research facilities and now the progenitors are run by hyper-intelligent dolphins, that would be fine. Like, of all the kooky things to come out of Mage, I'm like, you know what? This makes an intense amount of sense. The Void Engineers are led by a 3-century-old man-baby, and there's a sentient computer that operates the iterators. This is actually entirely reasonable that hyper-intelligent, transdimensional whales run the Progenitors. That's money on the table. That one's free for you, Paradox, if you're looking for where to take Mage 5th edition. But they also indicate that the upgraded model has intelligence of 7. I know Mage doesn't use these rules, but Mummy, of all games, gives us rules for stats that go above 5. And if we look at those rules, we get to an interesting place where with intelligence 7, you can overcome the fact that normally you cannot roll intelligence plus a knowledge for something you don't have, which means that a hyper-intelligent dolphin who spends 1 point of willpower can determine the true name of any Umbrood. And I'm here for that. Any quest that involves we need to find the true name of blank, I am going to say within the canon of Mage, the best answer is a hyper-intelligent dolphin. Let the games begin. So that's there. Just the idea that there are a lot of dolphins that are probably significantly smarter than Isaac Newton or John von Neumann running around out there is a choice. Also, we get dragons. I mean, dragons are just cool. Finally, we get character templates, and these are fine. They're actually pretty well written. In a lot of cases, I would not use these for character templates, but I would use them as NPCs. They are sufficiently detailed in terms of motivation and why people are doing things that I would probably drop them in there. The other thing that is notable in this book, there are several cases where they recognize the existence of people with appearance 3 or greater, so the Progenitors got hotties in it, and I appreciate that. There's the research assistant really looks like Christy Alley, and the damage control operative really looks like Eve Mendez. I don't know if that's just me or if that's where the artists were going for, but generally I like these. And that brings us to the close of the very exciting, very option-filled Chapter 3.
Well, starting off this chapter with scientists of note, I think I agree with you. They were reasonable, they were believable, but they were too mild and low key to really grab my interest. It's like if I'm going to throw some NPCs into my game, probably not these. They're just not what I'm looking for. I thought the prime influence, quote unquote, Bermuda Triangle in one part of the mountains of Tibet was a pretty cool idea. I would like to run with that. 2 pages for what they call rumors and lore, and I thought they were great. I complained about how the New World Order, legends section was kind of weak. This was really good. I thought they had some exciting ideas, some fun stuff in there, and I'm just hoping we see some more of those in the next 2 convention books. A section on all progenitor amalgam. They have some advice on what that might look like, how to do it. It was serviceable, but really not inspiring. The sample amalgam was well done. They say there's more than 2 people, but they show 2 characters there, and they basically are traveling troubleshooters trying to recapture escaped or lost progenitor projects that the leadership doesn't want other people to know about. I thought it was very cool. I like both of those samples characters. I would use them. When we get to gear, before we get to the 4 categories of specialized gear, we have more normal gear that progenitors would use. And again, it's one of those times where it's like, yes, this is reasonable, I can see this, but it's just kind of boring for me. I don't see how I would really need to use this in my story writing or scenes that I'm playing out with my characters, except to say, yeah, it's in the background, it's doing its thing. So a little dull for me. When they got into the 4 categories of adaptive prosthetics, biomod, sensory alterations, and xenotransplants, I agree with Terry. I don't think those categories were so well thought out. You could take sensory alterations, just lump it into biomods, and you're fine. It's like, yeah, so you could have 3 categories and probably even work better. But I do like the idea of dividing it up into, look, these are inorganic prosthetics that you can attach or even swap out because you have sort of a, universal adapter. And then you've got the biomods, and then you've got the xenotransplants. But I gotta say, I'm having a hard time with the xenotransplants. The heart of a werewolf, the skin of a troll. Does anyone believe that the magic of these creatures is in one specific body part? Like, does anyone believe that it's the teeth of the vampires that gives them all their magic power? It's like, most of us kind of think it's like, well, isn't it kind of the whole thing? I mean, aren't trolls really tough because they have tough bones? I mean, and muscles and skin? I mean, doesn't it all kind of go together? So, yeah, I just don't see how any man off the street would say, oh, yes, it's the left foot. That's what gives it the magic. It's like, no, it's a magical creature. All of its body is magical. And as Terry was saying, the xenotransplants that they list here, I don't think any of them would be desirable for player characters. I mean, I could see players in my game saying, oh, what are some cool gear we could get for this mission, or make my character really stand out. And so I show them the xenotransplants, they look through it and they're like, seriously? I was like, would you like any of these? No. Alrighty then, didn't think so. It's like, yeah, why would you want something that has like more than a 1 in 5 chance of blowing your head off at any random time? Or, oh, this heart will make you stronger, but at any point it could burst out of your chest. It's like, well, then forget it. I've got my sphere magic. I can, get some gear or something. I don't need this. When we come to rotes, yes, as Terry said, there were some oddballs in here. For example, nanotech integration gives you certain abilities. It's basically like a high-level rote that a progenitor will cast upon another technocrat, giving them certain abilities. And it's like, okay, yeah, I agree that's cool, but it makes it sound like the big benefits are permanent and there's no drawbacks. It's like, yeah, I have a problem with that. If you're going to get souped up that much, there's something you've got to give up. In Guide to the Technocracy, they basically say if you get a really cool power, then you get some permanent paradox, or you get a risk of an accident in the field, or something like that. But nanotech integration is just, yeah, it's really cool, and there you go. When it gets to Primal Infusion, Primal Net, I feel that the reason these two rotes were put into the book was to explain how back in, I think it was either the Book of Chantries in early first edition or the first Progenitor Convention book, they are telling you that these progenitors are able to take quintessence out of the bodies of sleepers who are hospital patients, but they don't give you no systems for it. And so it's like, okay, now that we're looking at the progenitors again, that's kind of a glaring flaw. Why don't we kind of patch that up? It's like, okay, I can see that. Primal infusion, which is basically keeping a patient that has gone into a coma because of an accident or something, you keep them in that coma and they generate quintessence. And then primal net is a way to draw that quintessence out and store it for technocrats. This whole book has this theme running through it of, hey, we used to be really rotten and doing questionable things, but now we want to be clean, decent people and do some good in the world, whether it's for our fellow conventions or for sleepers. And it's like, oh, and by the way, we're still doing that thing where people who are in comas, we lock them in there, never let them get out, suck the quintessence out of them. But hey, we're nice guys, just as long as we're clear on that. And Terry also mentioned the stopgap resurrection. It's like, okay, the dead body, but he hasn't been dead long. I'm going to bring him back to life, ask him a few questions, and then kick him to the side because he's not useful anymore. It's like, okay, this is a highly questionable rote because you are basically telling the storyteller how to interpret what happens when someone dies and then and their spirit comes back to their body. You're telling them to interpret how that works. And I think that that's something that should be more dramatic, more meaningful, more rare. Storytellers probably are going to have their own idea of how that works. And so I think this stopgap resurrection pushes too much on a storyteller. So I just didn't feel comfortable with using it as is and handing it out to some storyteller saying, yeah, you use this one too. We get to the creatures section. We had basically cephalopods, squids, octopus, etc. And then you've got cetaceomorphs, dolphins, porpoises, whales, etc. We've got dragons, and it says dragons, they have more than 4 legs. They've like crossed between a dragon and a centipede kind of, which I thought was kind of cool. And then you've got the sauropods, which I was thinking, what, dinosaurs? No, they're lizard men, and they're not very smart, and they're not very large. And so it's like, okay, I don't know what this is doing in here, but maybe we could do something with this. I thought it was really cool to have 2 kinds of sea creatures because it goes well with the undersea bases that we heard so much about in Chapter 1. And so I thought that was like supporting material. And so I was very pleased to see that because, yeah, I'd like to do some scenes or even some stories with undersea bases. And so using these creatures with that would be really cool. But yeah, like Terry said, I'm reading about the cetaceomorphs, dolphins, whales, etc. It says all of them are like really, really intelligent, and some of them are like super intelligent. And I was thinking, why? Well, why them and not the lizard men or something like that? Well, what is it about them? And it says basically the big whales, they've got intelligence over 5, and so you got to ask, well, then why aren't they running the show? Why don't the progenitors just like hand them all of their experiments and say, yeah, fix it and get it back to me because I don't want to spend all my time on this.
No thumbs.
It's like
no thumbs.
What?
No thumbs.
The opposable.
No opposable
we got
thumbs.
modern technology.
That's how we keep them down. That's what's.
I think the technocrats can hook a keyboard to a super brain. So
once we see a dolphin with thumbs, we're screwed.
Maybe. But we got the Gen Engineers. If anyone can give dolphins thumbs, but yeah, we're digressing. But Terry and I both agree that making hyperintelligent cetaceomorphs, 1, it doesn't make sense, and 2, it's really going to change the world of Mage. I mean, things are going to be different if you've got them there. So that's worth thinking about. Closing out this chapter is talking about rotes, gear, equipment, etc. how sphere effects can be done by progenitors. And so my big question starting into this book was, okay, the progenitors specialize in life sphere. They can do it better than the other technocrats, but the other technocrats can do it too. So can you help me see how the life effects done by the progenitors are better or more convenient or less paradox prone than, say, Iteration X? They can learn life sphere. How are they different? It doesn't tell me. Just, I don't know. It seems like of all books, this should be the one to tell me that, and it wasn't here. And so it's not a game breaker, but I was a little disappointed in that one. It's just one of those things you pretty much expect to see. That wraps up my thoughts on Chapter 3. And I guess at this point, Terry, you ready to move on to the general section? I was wondering what you thought of the book as a whole.
Oh, but first we have the epilogue where there's dialogue.
Yes.
Yeah. Characters discuss things, and they point at things and say, yep, that's my wife. She's in HR. I'm like, that's a stereotype, but okay. And they're like, if anyone asks, we're friends. You're totally not a psychic. And then a lot of things are vaguely alluded to. And I read it twice, and I'm like, what the dink is going on? And then there's a Zoom call at the end where they're like, Johnson, you're doing a lot of good work. Would you like to research anything you want at the bottom of the ocean, possibly led by hyperintelligent dolphins? And he's like, I can't. There's too much actually useful shit I need to do. You know, where sleepers are, the people we're trying to protect. And then the people in charge are like, damn it, people keep saying that. And then the book ends. So I didn't want to leave that out of our walkthrough.
Good point. Yeah, the epilogue took two of the themes running through the book, and they wanted to address them head on, which you could argue was kind of unnecessary because they were addressed so thoroughly through the book. But I can see capping that off. One is in the epilogue, the progenitor character learns something that he cleverly passes to his two colleagues. One, I think, is a Syndicate member, and the other's in the New World Order. And it helps one of them to reunite with their son, and it helps those two technocrats to have a better relationship with each other. And it says in the beginning of the book that, we are the progenitors, unlike the New World Order, who wants to, snap their fingers and make the conventions fall into line. Instead of a commanding or a firm hand, we want to be the helping hand. We want to actually help people to get along better, to appreciate that they need each other, be the carrot instead of the stick. And so it drove that home. And so, okay, I guess that's nice. And also, again and again and again in the book, they're saying, we don't hide in the lab anymore. We're out in the field. And so at the end of the story, the guy says, I don't want to hide in the lab. I want to get out in the field. It's like, yeah, we know. But okay, thanks for telling us again.
As far as overall thoughts, this book was a very exciting mixed bag. The thing that I find interesting about the progenitors is they are generally an individualistic group on the spectrum of the technocracy, where at one end we have the Syndicate and the progenitors, and the other end we have the New World Order and the Iterators, and the Void Engineers are kind of in the middle, and I kind of like that as a framework. They've also always been the group that is most capable of asking very uncomfortable questions about what it is like to be human, to the point where in the Guide to the Technocracy, in the progenitor section, the quote's something like, we question what it is to be human, and we have some answers, and all of them scare us. And you're like, huh! So to me, the progenitors are always the group that both does what they do, where the ethical concerns very much fight with their own curiosity. And I find that question to be fascinating in a way that is kind of echoed in the Void Engineers, but not so much. They talk about how they can be seduced by money and the Nefandi, and I think that is a fantastic role-playing angle. And they really do a great job of saying, hey, you can play these as playing characters. This is the information you need to do it. And I think it knocks it out of the park for that everywhere but the systems. I really don't think the rotes hold together. There isn't a discussion of how spheres are done. We don't get a lot of information on that. You're really going to have to go back to Guide to the Technocracy if you want a walkthrough of those. I don't think there's enough information to explain how a technocracy civil war would happen. They've successfully explained why there are divisions, but civil war is a strong term. They keep bringing up the illegal drug market, and just to note, the illegal drug market in 2020 is about $360 billion. All of pharmacology is about 1.3 billion. And in comparison, Apple's revenue in 2020 was 275 billion. So I get the whole illegal drug angle, but they could go legit and probably make a lot more money. And they don't do a good job of explaining why they don't. It may be a case where they need cash, but they also talk about how they bring in money, but they're also subject to the Syndicate. And they don't explain that because running an illegal drug cartel doesn't seem like it's necessarily the hardest thing where they would need to, if you're an enlightened scientist, really need to call in a Syndicate member to run that operation and to pay for things. There's some internal inconsistency issues that I had. For instance, in one part it says half the convention is now part of applied sciences. Later in the applied sciences section it says it's 10%. There's no good way to me to reconcile those. There's no good guidance, as I said, on what should be a prosthesis or a biomed or a xenotransplantation or a source for xenotransplantation. I do think it's a great quest fodder to say, hey, for the next mission, you're going to need to deal with the vacuum of space and you need to go slay this creature to get it. And if I'm going to put my players through that, the downsides need to be nearly negligible. If I'm going to force them through that kind of story thing or spend that much experience points, it really needs to be worth it. And when you compare a lot of the stuff to a 3, 4, 5-point talisman like we got in Forged by Dragon's Fire, a 5-point talisman changes a game and has nearly no downsides to it, unless it is paired with Dark Fate or something like that. So there, I thought there were a lot of balancing issues. Like the prehensile tail is like, people aren't meant to have a tail. So there's an added difficulty penalty. Revised already gives us rules on splitting pools, which represents division of skills like that. And you figure the progenitors of all people would figure out how to wire it so that people figure it out real quick. The sensory alterations are a bunch of basic types. What does it mean for a cluster of cells in your body to have access to enlightenment and primal energy? Like just mechanically, I don't even know what that means. And in a lot of cases, that enlightenment was never even rolled. And one of the other things is they mentioned the role of extraordinary citizens. The NWO lays out the idea, at least for the NWO, that there are a few enlightened agents sitting on top of an army of sympathizers. We don't get an idea that this group works the same way. So does that mean the progenitors are much smaller compared to the NWO? Or do we just assume that all the conventions have armies of unawakened allies? I mean, the NWO even went to the point of like giving us numbers for it, saying it was like 22-1 or something like that. And this doesn't follow it up. So I don't know how big the progenitors are. I did like the presentation of the progenitors as kind of being the other half of the iterators, being the two group that do kind of hard science, and that feeds the progress of information to the rest of the technocracy. And we don't get much information on how that engine works. The presentation of the enemies being mortals is interesting, but for that to happen, we've never really been given guidance on how to run that campaign where mortals are really the enemies. So again, a lot of great stuff. I could tell the heart was put into it. Really could have used some polish. And I think in some places it gives me more questions than I have answers. So what do you think, Adam?
One thing I wanted to bring attention to that is easy to overlook is the biological experiments of mages in the distant past. Page 42 of this book mentions the forerunners of the facade engineers in the ancient world and how they used magic to create weird creatures. This has been mentioned in past mage books. A storyteller can make use of this to set the tone of their mage setting. In early editions of Mage, bygones were magical creatures that implied the universe is a very magical and mysterious place. If those bygones are instead the result of human experiments with sphere magic, then the world is a more rational, understandable place. Used well, this can set a tone for your game, for your mage world, that makes the technocrats look more reasonable and mystics less reasonable. So yeah, I just wanted to call that one out. The drive to make progenitors more active is a result of the technocracy's origin. They started as mysterious masterminds who hid behind the menaces they created. In early first edition, the technocracy was NPC villains, syndicate members who controlled the world's financial markets, and progenitors who created monsters didn't have to leave their desks to be ominous. Now that they're player characters, they need to leave their desks to be interesting. So this means some adjustments. So I think that was the main thrust behind we're active in the field now. It's like, yeah, it's because we're player characters. We mentioned the editing problems during this book. Yeah, there's always going to be some. And I guess we all know that they can be irritating. But I just think I'm noticing more of these than in the earlier run of revised edition books. So it made me have to stop a couple of times and like kind of put a sentence together before I could move on. Okay, one of my real criticisms for this book is victors. They're in the fiction, in the prologue and the epilogue at the end of the book, there is a rogue agent who they call Victor, and they make it clear, like, yeah, he's one of the victors, and we're bringing him back into the fold. Like, well, yeah, okay, but victors were the genetically engineered soldiers and tough guys of the progenitors, is how they enforced their will, and they sent them to fight against player characters in the first edition of this game. So I wanted to see something for victors. Specifically, I wanted to see them made interesting, because in the past it just says they're really, physically fit, handsome men and they're clones, and they'll attack your player characters. It's like, yeah, but make them interesting. Give them some edge or some gimmick or something. Make them stand out. And instead, they just sort of swept them under the rug. Said, yeah, forget about it. Now, you could argue that, this is because the player characters are the tough soldiers in the field now instead of NPC, bioengineered menaces. But no, I think that's a big part of every edition of Mage, is every convention has their own kind of soldiery, and I think the victors is that for the progenitors. So they should have been in here, and they should have been made interesting. I think calling paradox rejection is clever, but I do not like the trend I'm seeing in these revised edition convention books of every convention having its own term for paradox. I think the technocracy as a whole needs an alternate term for paradox. Or honestly, I think paradox is a fine term. It doesn't have any occult or mystical baggage. It's a modern sounding word. I think it's great. The reason I'm going on about this is because Terry and I have talked to a lot of people who are new to Mage, or they've read a few Mage books, but they're timid about jumping in and trying to run a game for people because they think, it's really hard. And you talk to them, it's like, what's hard about it? It's not hard to buy some 10-sided die. No, it isn't. But there's so many terms. There's so much terminology in these books that it can confuse people who are new to Mage. And it's like, yeah, I got to agree. When every convention has their own term for paradox, and even the Avatar Storm has multiple names, yeah, there's a buildup of terms after a couple of years of writing Mage books, and that is something to think about. A big thing, this is the first book in Revised Edition that finally admits the reality of the Avatar Storm, or dimensional anomaly in this case. It makes several mentions of friends, family, and colleagues lost in the incident and the pain of the survivors. Many books before this mention losing the Masters to the Avatar Storm. Those of us who were paying attention while reading the books of the first two editions of Mage know that Horizon Realms had more students and young mages than Masters, and more non-mages than mages. Saying we lost most of the Masters in the Avatar Storm makes me think of military generals that bomb large areas overseas and then talk about necessary collateral damage. It's so callous, it just upsets me. I've been trying to, be polite about Revised Edition before now, but it just made me feel good to read this book and see. It's like, yes, lots of people were lost in the dimensional anomaly. Lots of people are broken up about losing it, and it's more than just a few Masters were rubbed out and we're glad to be rid of them. This book has a mandate to make the progenitors less evil, and I agree. The first convention book for progenitors, it made them cartoonishly evil. I mean, they were just bad attitude, bad mood, killing people over minor irritations. It was just, yeah, these are cartoonishly evil. They had a guy come in, it's like, yeah, I sell drugs on the street. And, the point of view character says, he looked a lot like Satan. It's like, okay, look, this is over the top. So I can see how this book has a drive to make them less evil and more human and a little more decent. But I think in the process, they took some of the fun, some of the interest out of the progenitors, some of the stuff that made them cool to me, and perhaps other people as well. So I can see why they did it, but I think they overcompensated a bit. So I think they could have been a little more subtle and intentional about how they did it, but I can understand why they did it. So that basically wraps up my thoughts on the book. I had a few adventure ideas I was hoping to run by our listeners. So let's start off with the first one. A large submarine vessel is converging on Yamaja Station, a technocrat facility at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. It isn't responding to communications, and its stealth technology makes it very hard to locate. Damage Control has assigned the players to the response crew for the emergency. Before the dimensional anomaly, a piece of the hive was brought to Earth for study. See page 118 of Book of Worlds. This progenitor project was kept off the books, and now its undersea lab has been destroyed. It looks like the hostile vessel originated there. The players have data that may help destroy the vessel, but they must keep the convention's secrets. Void engineer submarines and crew await the players' orders. The players are given chemical samples from the vessel's trail that indicate a cetaceomorph is aboard or perhaps following it. What does the mystery craft want? How is the cetaceomorph involved? This story can give your players a taste of leadership and test their underwater skills. Number 2, players learn of a progenitor street lab in a large city's poor neighborhood that is about to be shut down. This lab made a breakthrough discovery of a chemical compound that could reduce the effects of drug addiction. The pharmacopoeists want them shut down because they're bad for business. The progenitor leadership wants them shut down before their theft of resources from other constructs is discovered. A brilliant, newly enlightened scientist will be erased to cover things up. Can the players rescue the young scientist and the new discovery? Can they operate in a poor neighborhood where they'll probably stick out like a sore thumb? Number 3, the player's technocrat supervisor promises them promotions and access to rare equipment if they'll accept a dangerous investigation of Research Expedition 215 that disappeared in the mountains of Tibet before the dimensional anomaly. The rush to begin and the secrecy required are notable. Coordinates of the reactivated beacon for the expedition's first casualty led to a burnt and blasted shelf on the side of a mountain. A pattern of primal energy is revealed in the bleak mountains that is pulling items and people in from years ago. A team of Void Engineer pan-dimensional core soon appears with orders for the players to join their hidden base. Encrypted files in the player's possession open up. Their new orders are to investigate Office 42, a secret department of the technocracy that took over hidden operations after the dimensional anomaly broke contact with Control. Members of Research Expedition 215 are alive and need help to escape the hidden base. Can the players uncover Office 42's secrets and escape to safety? Give the players 25 to 30 points of cool technocracy devices to entice them. Once in the mountains, they'll need it. Well, Terry, were there any interesting quotes you noticed while reading through this?
The New World Order is the brains of the technocracy. But this brain is very old and has suffered dementia and paranoia for far too long. And I thought that was a good summary of how the progenitors view the NWO. Is they're like, you checking this out? You seeing this?
We're the head of this operation. Oh yeah, we don't doubt it. You're just a crazy head.
Yeah. maybe we need to get that head investigated. Do you know what we're reading next?
What we are reading next is the revised convention book for the Syndicate. Hey, Terry, can you tell us about the executive producers?
The show is made possible by our executive producers, who, without their help, we would still make these episodes, we'd just be much more aggravated about it. And they are Anders S., Andrew Edelstein, Andy, Berto, Boo, Boogers to the Six, Brado the Blue, Brendan Morrill, Bryce Perry, Chris Zack, Dan Svensson, Dennis Osborne, Entropy_Prime, Freddie, Gargle Noir, Guy Conan Stewart, Isabella Castillo, Jason Kennedy, Jason W. Biggs, Jeff Waugh, Jenna F., John Horton, John Magnuson, Josh Golden, Josh Hillerup, Josh Heath, Carl Halperin, La Boule, Leslie Weatherstone, Lexa Conjurer, Michael Creedle, Michael Parker, Nabarro, Neil Patterson, Nikita Klaymanov, Patrick Mulder, Ralph Scheinhammer, Richard Bat Brewster, Ryan Hilton, Ryan Kendi, Sam Tobin, Stephen Carter, William Connolly, William Martin, W. Starter, and our Oracle supporters, Christopher Phillips, Oracle of Wildly Intelligent Dolphins, and Buck Farmer, Oracle of Poorly Thought Through but really fun parts that have been ripped out of other Night Folk. Adam, where can people go to find out more about what we're doing?
Well, if you have something to say, please contact us at magethepodcast@gmail.com with your questions, comments, or feedback. Go ahead. We can take it. Subscribe to Mage the Podcast on iTunes, Google Play, TuneIn, and other aggregators. If you like the show, others might like it too. And if you leave a review of Mage the Podcast, it makes us more visible in their searches. You can follow us on Twitter at Mage the Podcast. We're also on the web at magethepodcast.com. You can listen to past episodes there, see the order in which we produced them, and see the complete show notes that we prepare for you. Well, that about wraps it up for this time, but I just wanted to say thanks everyone for listening, and until next time, truth until paradox, baby.
Go out there and do questionable genetic experiments on yourself. Either you're going to get a cool-ass scar or some superpowers, or at least that is what this book has led me to believe. Bye.